x gets bigger and bigger. What's the answer? What happens to the height of the graph, or what happens to y, the height of the graph, as x gets bigger and bigger? So as this gets bigger and bigger, the fraction gets smaller and smaller. It gets closer and closer to 0, right? Which is what this picture looks like, right? Right? So we're asking, as something gets bigger and bigger, what happens to this, right? So that's the kind of thing we'll do when we learn calculus. And we could ask the same thing about that here. We could say, what happens to the future value as we let m get bigger and bigger? Well, it's not clear, right? You don't know what the answer is. Does anybody know what the answer is? I don't think so. Right? Nobody knows. It's not. But what is very surprising, and I think we'll show it, but I don't think we'll do it right now. It's probably better if we do it after we look at calculus. But we'll show that e to the x comes into the equation. Because e to the x is, well anyway, e to the x is going to come into this equation. So it's going to be in here. So if you compound, if the number of compounding periods is infinitely large, or the compounding time is infinitely small, then the formula, that e to the x will appear in the formula for the future value. Okay? So that's called continuous compounding. Continuous compounding will have e to the x in it as part of the calculation. Okay, because we don't know how to do continuous compounding, right? We can't let m go to infinity, as they say. But when you do that, you get e to the x in the formula, and then you can get the answer using e to the x. Okay, so we'll look at that later. Okay? Okay, so let's do a quiz. Does anybody have any questions? So what did we say so far? What situations did we deal with? Well, today we dealt at the beginning with what?
Interest.
What was that called? Simple interest. And then we did that, and we also switched PV and FV, right? So if we want to know FV, we did that, but then we could also say, suppose you want to have $1 million in 20 years, how much do you have to invest now? So that's switching the PV and the FV, so we did that, right? Then what else did we do? And what else did we do? Then we went to compound interest, and we discovered the formula will basically have an exponent in it, like we have 1 plus r to the 5 there, right? So we discovered that there's going to be an exponent, right? Which, that was the number of years, right? And then we considered what? Letting the number of compounding periods vary per year. So we introduced the m. Right? We introduced the m, which was the number of compounding periods per year, and we got a formula including m. Okay? So we have that now as well. Okay, so that's the end of, well, last thing is, how about, in this case, when you're doing compounding interest, suppose you want to say, okay, I want to have $1 million. At the end, how much do I have to invest? So then you have to solve this equation for PV, right? So before we solved another equation for PV, I made a mistake here. This was the equation for PV right here. But now it's going to be what? What's the equation for PV? PV equals FV divided by this. Right? So if you're doing compounding, you have to use different formula. Right? Okay? So you also should see some problems like that in the homework. Okay, so let's try one of these as a quiz. So, does everybody have a calculator? have a calculator? Okay, so, because I think you need a calculator for these. Okay, let's try this one. Okay. So I suggest you write it out first. Well, it's up to you. But I would write it. Yeah, you can round it. You can round it to any number. You can round it with no decimals, or 1 decimal, or 2 decimal digits. Okay, anybody need more time? Okay, let's stop that. Okay, now just for fun, before we go back to that, just want to
From NPR News, this is All Things Considered. I'm Melissa Block.
And I'm Robert Siegel. Nearly the whole financial system bought into subprime mortgages and the securities that were backed by them, and that amounted to bundles of bad debt. But in his new book, The Big Short, Michael Lewis writes about people who didn't buy in. In fact, they bet against the colossal tower of debt that Wall Street built. They shorted it, and they profited from its eventual collapse. For Michael Lewis, The Big Short is his return to the scene of the crime. 20 years ago, he wrote a book about his experience working as a young bond trader at Salomon Brothers. Liar's Poker was an astonishing tale of kids fresh out of Ivy League colleges making huge decisions about other people's money with no earthly qualification for doing so. By the time of the financial crisis, the generation that he wrote about in Liar's Poker had become established on Wall Street. It was a generation typically up to its eyeballs in mortgage-backed securities. The people he writes about in The Big Short are outsiders by virtue of their youth or their personality. People like a young hedge fund manager based in San Jose, California, named Michael Burry.
He is a trained neurologist. He quit being a doctor during his residency at the Stanford Hospital because on his spare time, he's blogging about the stock market. But pretty soon his stuff is so good that he can see that Wall Street's reading it. He posts a message at the end of his blog one day saying, "I'm sick of medicine, I'm going to go invest money." And his track record over the next few years is astonishing. As he's doing this, he realizes that a lot of the companies he's investing in, their fortunes turn on this weird lending market called the subprime mortgage bond market. And because of who he is and how he's built, he doesn't like meeting people face to face. And he starts reading the prospectuses of
Did you hear that? He doesn't like meeting people face to face, even though he's training to become a medical doctor. Not a good match. But anyway, the subprime refers to this mortgage, has to do, I don't know why they call it subprime, but has to do with mortgages.
Subprime mortgage bond offerings. And he sees that in the structure of the loans, you can see the future disaster. And so he sets out to figure out how to bet against this. He realizes that Wall Street is going to create a market in insurance on these bonds, a credit default swap market on subprime mortgage bonds, and becomes the first investor off Wall Street to make the big bet against subprime mortgage bonds, and gets him into all kinds of trouble because everybody thinks he's a crazy.
He's in so early that his investors are saying, "What are you doing with these bets against subprime mortgage-backed securities? You're the guy who can find underperforming corporations and sell stock in them."
And he keeps trying to explain them in very lucid letters. He says to them, in this world now, you can't sanely invest in a lot of these companies that I was investing in because of what's going on in this lending market. But what was interesting to me is, because he didn't really have much connection with other people, everything he did by email. And he saved it all. Mm-hmm. He had this perfect real-time record of what actually had happened in these markets. Here was the one guy I could trust in the middle of this crisis was this fellow with Asperger's syndrome and a glass eye. He also has a glass eye. He became the moral center of this market for me because he was the most honest character.
You're describing people who, in a way, have to be outsiders to some degree because they're going to take the view of a very, very small minority. So, in a way, it shouldn't be coincidental that the people you write about seem to be, their personalities seem to be in some way extreme.
Well, they are extreme characters, and they're in a very, each of them is in a curious position of being a sane man in an insane world. For me, this story, the book, to me, was partly a book not just about the financial markets, but about human perception. That you have this body of facts out there in the financial world, and the vast majority of the people in that world are organizing the facts into one kind of picture, and it's a pretty picture. And a handful of other people take the exact same facts, but they organize it into a different picture. And it reminded me, psychologists play with this conundrum all the time. These optical illusions that people are presented with. And you look at a drawing, and from one angle it looks like a gorgeous woman in profile, and from another angle, actually, what you're doing is staring into the face of a horrible old witch. 99.9% of the people in the financial system saw this beautiful woman in profile, and this 0.1% of the people saw this horrible old witch. And the question was, why did these people see this thing?
How would you sum up the role that Goldman Sachs played in the period that you're writing about, when it was both betting for and against the subprime mortgage market?
embarrassing and wildly irresponsible. Goldman Sachs was relatively unscathed by the collapse of the subprime mortgage bond market because at the very end, just before it collapsed, they reversed their historical long position in that market and got short the market so that they actually made a bit of money when the market collapsed.
So that word short means basically betting against it. When you say, I'm shorting a stock, I think it means something like, I'm selling it short, I forget. Anyway, it kind of means like you're selling it oh yeah, I think it means you're selling it before you own it. So you can do that. You know, if somebody else is willing to do that with you, you can do it. You can say, okay, I promise to pay you, I'm selling it, yeah. I'll give you these shares in 100 days, and you know, you have to, I promise to do that, and you give me the money now. So I'll sell them to you for, you know, $1,000 per share, and you have to promise to buy them in 100 days, and then I'll sell them kind of at a discount because you're making this deal with me, which puts you at risk. So I'll give you a kind of a discount on it if you'll do this with me. So that's what happened, right? That's called selling it short, when you don't actually have it. So I don't even buy it. I just say, I have the obligation to buy it because I have to give it to you in 100 days, but I don't have to have it right now, so I don't even buy it now, right? So what happens? I think the market is going to crash, so I'll sell, okay, they're selling like at $100 per share right now, so I say, if you promise to buy it in 100 days, okay, because you're taking a kind of risk, I'll sell it to you for $95. So you think, oh, that's good, you know, everything's great, I'm going to make $5 per share, right? But I'm thinking, oh, I think it's going to crash, and the price is going to go down to $2, right? So I'm going to get in 100 days, I'm going to get, you know, you're going to pay me $95, or you already paid me $95. I'm going to have to give you the shares in 100 days, but I'll be able to pick them up at $2. Right? So I'll make a fortune. Right? That's what selling short is. So these guys did those kinds of deals. So, you know, people can structure all kinds of deals as long as somebody else is willing to do it, right? That's the way the market works.
But along the way, they designed securities that were close to designed to fail. The sort of reductio ad absurdum of their attitude toward the marketplace was their relationship with the insurer AIG. We all know that the big Wall Street firms used AIG through 2005 as a place to dump this mushrooming subprime mortgage bond risk that they were taking. So they got AIG to...
So there's a company called AIG, which is probably the biggest insurance company in the world. So they were insuring, you know, these mortgages. So that's even more complicated, right? You got the mortgage companies, but then they don't actually own the mortgage. They sell it to an insurance company, right? Because they don't want to be stuck with all of it. So there's all this kind of stuff going on all over the place. And so they sell the debt to the insurance company. So AIG was actually the one that was holding all of this, but they realized at some point that it was, you know, ridiculous. So I don't know what they did. I forget what they did.
Or the riskiest subprime mortgage bonds. But what's less well known is that Goldman Sachs led the way. It was Goldman Sachs talked AIG into doing this business. And it wasn't just a few $1 million, it was $20 billion worth of insurance. They got AIG to insure on things that would ultimately be worth basically zero.
At least some of the people you write about who were shorting the subprime market, the young guys at Cornwall Capital, say, they thought this went beyond, or at least they said often, it went beyond wrong and irresponsible to fraudulent. Should there be some more prosecutions of people who were fraudulently packing junk debt and calling it investment-grade securities?
The easy answer is yeah. You know, you could throw some people in jail. but it requires you first to divine their motives. What I found is that more often than not, the people at the center of the doomsday machine were deluded themselves. And the problem isn't criminal behavior. That wasn't the problem in this case. The story of American capitalism in recent history is not really the story of Bernie Madoff. It's a story of very bad incentives causing people to behave in very bad but probably perfectly legal ways.
But you compare what's happened since the fall of Lehman Brothers, let's say, with what happened during the S&L crisis. Dozens of prosecutions, I think hundreds actually of prosecutions coming out of the S&L collapse.
Yeah,
in this case, one failed prosecution of 2 Bear Stearns traders is what I've been able to come up with.
Well,
So they're discussing, whether people should pay a price. These guys that did this, whether they should be thrown in jail or not, whether they should be prosecuted. So he's making the argument that it wasn't them, it was the system that has these incentives, for people to behave this way. And so they were just behaving according to the rules of the system, which was skewed to do this kind of stuff. So that's what he's arguing. But I don't buy that. But anyway, that's what he says.
to your point, look how much the prosecutions in the S&L crisis achieved for us. We ended up with an even more insane financial system. I think that rather...
So they're referring to another crisis called the S&L crisis that happened maybe 20 years before this one, and where people were prosecuted. But now he's saying that even though they were prosecuted, things got worse. So he's arguing, so they shouldn't be prosecuted, but I don't think that's right.
trying to get even with a handful of people who behave